both sides of the aisle in Congress, in the media, in our intelligence services, in virtually every overfunded think tank in Washington, have suddenly aligned tonight on a single point of agreement. America must go to war in Syria immediately. Bashar al-Assad cannot continue to lead that country. He must be overthrown. Assad is an evil man, they tell us. His latest crime is a chlorine gas attack carried out over the weekend by his forces against a rebel-held suburb of Damascus. Assad's poison gas suffocated children. Pictures of the aftermath of that are all over the internet, and they are horrifying. Assad is a monster. That's the official story. Almost everyone in power claims to believe it. The push to war in Syria, by the way, has united politicians from both sides. Lindsey Graham and Howard Dean typically agree on very little. Not much at all. But today they are both calling for war in Syria. Graham is demanding massive attacks on the Syrian military. Dean is going even further than that. On Twitter, he called the president, quote, a wimp for merely sending thousands of troops and launching tons of bombs at Syria. That's not enough for Howard Dean, who, as you may remember, once ran for president as the peace candidate. Tonight, he wants total war in Syria. Television pundits, of course, strongly agree. This morning, the foreign policy team over on MSNBC explained that it's far more important for American troops to fight in Syria than it is to secure our own border here in America. Watch.
There's no question that now, all these years later, it is Donald Trump's challenge. He has to take action. He's spoken to Macron. What he ought to do is a coordinated action. There has to be a comprehensive response.
As Trump leaves to fight his imaginary border war, he's leaving the real war where we could make a difference, and said he's turning it over to Assad and to Iran and to ISIS. This is something that Barack Obama wouldn't even do if confronted with these set of facts.
Trump has to take action in Syria. Everyone nods sagely. That ought to make you nervous. Universal bipartisan agreement on anything is usually the first sign that something deeply unwise is about to happen, if only because there is nobody left to ask skeptical questions. And we should be skeptical of this, starting with the poison gas attack itself. All the geniuses tell us that Assad killed those children. But do they really know that? Of course they don't really know that. They're making it up. They have no real idea what happened. Actually, both sides in the Syrian civil war possess chemical weapons. How would it benefit Assad using chlorine gas last weekend? Well, it wouldn't. Assad's forces had been winning the war in Syria. The administration just announced its plans to pull American troops out of Syria, having vanquished ISIS. That's good news for Assad, and about the only thing he could do to reverse it and to hurt himself would be to use poison gas against children. Well, he did it anyway, they tell us. He's that evil. Please. Keep in mind, this is the same story they told us last April. Do you remember that? It was almost exactly a year ago. The new administration announced it was no longer seeking to depose Assad from power. Regime change was no longer our policy. So the usual war chorus in Washington started yelping, went berserk, and days later, Assad supposedly used sarin gas against civilians in Syria. There was video. We bombed a Syrian airbase in response to that. At the time, this show asked what seemed like the obvious question: are we really sure that Assad did that? It seems weirdly timed and counterproductive to him. Shut up, they explained. Of course we're sure. What an unpatriotic question. But of course they were lying. 2 months ago, the Secretary of Defense admitted that actually we still have no proof that Assad used sarin gas last year. The story, it turns out, was propaganda. It was designed to manipulate Americans, just like so much of what they say. We've seen this movie before, and we know how it ends. But just for the sake of argument, let's assume they're not lying this time. Let's assume Assad did just use chlorine gas against kids. He's perfectly capable of that, by the way, not defending his moral character. Let's say he did do it. Would that be worth starting a new war over? Overthrowing Assad's regime in Syria would result in chaos. Many thousands would die. In fact, we might likely see the genocide of one of the last remaining Christian communities in the Middle East, and we ought to care about that. Some of the dead, of course, would be American servicemen. A new war would cost us tens of billions of dollars, maybe hundreds of billions. Would it make America safer? Would it make the region more stable? Let's see. How exactly did regime change work in Iraq and Libya? Doesn't matter, say our moral leaders on CNN and everywhere else. Atrocities like this cannot be tolerated. Okay, but let's be real. We do tolerate atrocities like this all the time. For example, there's a devastating famine killing children in Yemen right now. The Saudis are causing that famine. Should we drop tomahawks on Riyadh in response? Not until it's on YouTube, apparently. When you conduct foreign policy by viral video, pictures are essential. But in real life, Syria is a highly complicated place. With Assad gone, who would run it exactly? Do we have another strongman in place to install? Or is it our hope that a stable democracy will magically appear in the wake of this protracted civil war? And who exactly are these moderate rebels you're always hearing about, the ones that we're supporting with your tax dollars? Well, a lot of them turn out to be Islamist crazies. For example, the city where the chemical attack just occurred is mostly controlled by the Army of Islam. It's a radical group that has called for establishing an Islamic state under Sharia law in Syria. That group's founder called for exterminating all Shia Muslims and Alawites from the country. But we're supposed to wage a new war on this group's behalf. Why is that exactly? Back in 2013, when the Syrian civil war was still in its early days, one onlooker weighed in on Twitter. Here's part of what he wrote, quote, "We should stay the hell out of Syria. The rebels are just as bad as the current regime. What will we get for our lives and billions of dollars? Zero." In another tweet, he said this, quote, "Let the Arab League take care of Syria. Why are these rich Arab countries not paying us for the tremendous cost of such an attack?" And in yet another tweet, he said this, "What will we get for bombing Syria beside more debt and a possible long-term conflict?" Of course, you know who wrote that. It was Donald Trump. And he was right. And that's one of the reasons he got elected president. And now the same people who brought you a dying American middle class, undefended American borders, and endless pointless wars in countries you could not find on a map are telling the president he's got to depose Assad for reasons that are both unclear and demonstrably dishonest. And by the way, it may happen. But before it does, Congress ought to consider a brand new constitutional amendment. Let's call it the Lindsey Graham Amendment. And here's what it would say. Congress shall topple no government until it finishes rebuilding the last government it toppled. And furthermore, talk show generals shall be required to personally visit the battlefield of every war they advocate for. End of amendment. That would have an immediate and positive effect. Let's hope it passes. Senator Roger Wicker is a Republican representing the state of Mississippi, and he joins us tonight. Senator, thanks for coming on. What is the American national security interest that would be served by regime change in Syria?
Well, if you care about Israel, you have to be interested at least in what's going on in Syria. We're fighting ISIS there. Iran is seeking to dominate the whole region. I think we have national interests in Syria. But let me say this about what candidate Trump may have said, or what he said before he was a candidate. You know, there is information you receive when you're president of the United States that you really don't have as a candidate, and I appreciate the president putting a team around him that I have confidence in. Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I think are going to give the president good advice. John Bolton's starting today, and I
there are
think,
smart and decent people around him.
They're going to tell him what he needs to hear.
Well, and there's certainly a lot of those people are smart. But I just want to get back to the core question that I think a lot of voters have, which is what's the American national security interest that is served? You said if you care about Israel, I do care about Israel. But what's the American national security interest that would be served by regime change? You can think of a lot of potential downsides, deaths, cost, etc. How would this country become safer by overthrowing Assad?
I'm not sure that regime change is still our goal there. It was the goal of Barack Obama. It hasn't really been our stated goal during this Trump administration. But defeating ISIS in Iraq and in Syria is still our goal. And I think that is in the national interest.
But wasn't defeating ISIS one of the goals of the Assad government? Of course, ISIS was a radical Sunni group. Assad is an Alawite allied with the Shiites. He was fighting ISIS as well. So why wouldn't we, if we believe ISIS is the main enemy, functionally find ourselves on the side of Assad?
Well, you're correct in this sense, and you're correct in many ways. It's complicated in Syria. There's no question about it. I mean, there's not a bunch of white hats and a bunch of black hats. So I'll give you that. We are, and we're not in the business of regime change, so I would challenge that. But it is within our national interest to make sure ISIS is defeated and we've almost got the job done. I just think it would be a mistake to pull away at this point. I'm very interested in the questions you're asking about whether this is some sort of a hoax, or whether this poison gas attack really didn't happen, was done by someone else.
Well, I'm not suggesting that.
That's a question that Mr. Putin is asking, and he has a right to ask it, and so do you. I find myself on the
I'm
not
not sure I understand the implication. I'm not sure I understand the implication of adding Putin to that equation.
He's asking. I'm just saying it's a question
that's not relevant. Slow down, Senator. That's not relevant to why I asked the question, and I hope you're not trying to impugn my motive by tying me to Putin, as so many on the left do. Let me ask again. We were told a year ago that the sarin gas attack in Syria was committed by regime forces, by Assad's regime. We learned 2 months ago that we don't really know that we were lied to about that. I would think as a U.S. Senator, you would have an interest in getting to the truth, because the truth matters, doesn't it?
I think it's perfectly fine for someone in a position like you to ask that question.
Why aren't you asking the question?
I'm convinced. Well, I've been listening to a lot over the last year, and for my purposes, I'm convinced that Bashar Assad was very much involved in the attack a year ago. The United Nations Security Council is currently, based on information I've heard, I think the United Nations
Can you characterize it for us? Because the Secretary of Defense. I'm sorry, I wouldn't typically interrupt you, but you suggested that I was somehow allied with Putin. So I think I can press you on this question.
I'm
the Secretary
suggesting
of
that
Defense.
You asked the same question that he asked, and that's fair.
So I must be a Russian agent. I get it, right?
I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that.
Because it's a very obvious question, actually, and the Secretary of Defense said 2 months ago that we didn't have proof, but you apparently have proof that the Secretary of Defense doesn't have. Could you characterize it for us?
No.
Why?
I'm not going to get into that further.
Okay. So are you satisfied that we know for a fact that the Assad regime, acting against its own strategic interests, was behind the chlorine gas attack this weekend?
And as I was about to say, Tucker, the UN Security Council is looking at that very issue right now. The President of the United States has concluded that, in fact, Bashar Assad was involved in this and was responsible for it. And I assume he's making that statement based on the best facts he can get from the Secretary of Defense and from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his incoming National Security Advisor.
Okay, well, I guess Putin and I would like a little more detail on that before we launch a new war on the basis of it. And do you think that's a fair question to ask?
I think you are asking interesting questions, and they need to be asked. Where I come down is that we have a strategic interest there, and it doesn't make sense for us